Hello, college biology students. I'm just going to pick up where I left off. We talked about the cell organelles, and now we're going to discuss those cell-to-cell interactions a little bit. And I know we went through, I think, the first slide where we talked about those surface proteins and kind of, what some of the jobs are, specifically as it pertains to blood typing. There's different markers. That determine the different blood types. And then the other video that I posted was the Amoeba Sisters, and they talked about that CD4 receptor and how important that, or how susceptible that was to the AIDS virus, and that's one of the reasons why AIDS can be so deadly. Although we've come a long way with that particular virus. But the other video also gave you a nice overview of some of those other cell communication and cell signaling. So I want to talk a little bit more about the cell-to-cell interactions. So cells communicate with each other a lot. Like clearly, there's a lot of different ways that they communicate. They communicate a little differently if they are next to each other, or whether they're next to each other in close proximity to each other but not touching, or farther away from each other. There's different ways that they are actually communicating with each other. So there's a lot of evidence, obviously, that cells do communicate with each other. Even knowing when there's room to divide, for example. So I always like to use the example of, so liver is an organ that you can donate part of your liver if someone needs a liver. Maybe I mentioned this in the other video, I don't remember. So you can donate half your liver to somebody who has, liver cancer or bad cirrhosis of the liver disease, and your liver will actually grow back till it reaches its normal size. And the reason it knows when to stop growing and to tell those cells when to stop dividing is because the cells can sense when there's room to divide. And when things start to get crowded, they're like, whoa, we are big enough. We need to stop dividing. So there's signals that are communicated with cells that are next to each other that tell them to stop dividing because there's just not room. Or if you have an injury to a muscle, for example, or to your skin, those cells know, hey, we have to repair an injury. There's room for some division here and creating more cells, so we have to go through the cell division process to kind of repair this area. And they know that they can sense that there's that there's an injury or that there's room for division, and they go through division process until the injury is healed. So our bodies are just amazing, and our cells are just incredible. So cell-to-cell cell connections mediate. One of the things they do is cell-to-cell adhesion, so keeping those cells stuck together or attached to each other, if you will. So something called tight junctions are actually connect those the cell membranes of cells that are next to each other or adjacent cells into a sheet. Obviously, this is really important on our skin, for our skin cells to be able to do that. We want them to be attached to each other and connected to each other to create that barrier against the outside world. But this also happens with our internal organs. They are connected also by tissue that kind of surrounds them and protects them. So we find those tight junctions also on those types of cells. And then also partitioning the plasma membrane of those cells into separate compartments, which aids in proteins moving things into and out of the cells. So they also, again, because they are right on that cell membrane, they have an important function for, just kind of moving proteins into and out of the cell as well. Anchoring junctions, think of course, what anchoring means is that those junctions are for holding things together. They attach cytoskeleton of cells to cytoskeleton of other cells. Two examples of this are cadherin proteins and also adherin proteins. So If we think of, remember we said that cytoskeleton provides that internal support, and they're like these pillars that are just randomly within the cell, and they are being torn down and rebuilt all the time based on, oh, did the cell move to a new position? Does it need different supports in there now, and so forth? But it actually is the junction that goes from one cytoskeleton to another cytoskeleton, and connects these maybe by actin fibers, or a lot of times by actin fibers. And then adherent junctions connect those actin filaments of one cell to those of neighboring cells, or with some sort of matrix that might be on the outside of the cell. So maybe there's some matrix out here for some reason that also needs to be attached to this cell. That also might be connected by at these anchoring junctions, an adherent junction. So a couple of these communicating junctions. So these are cells that are right next to each other, and there's electrochemical signaling that goes between the two of them. And the two that are mentioned in your book are something called gap junctions. They're complexes of 6 identical transmembrane proteins arranged in a perfect circle, and form kind of this tube, if you will. Provides passage large enough for small substances like sugars and amino acids and so forth to go from one cell to another. Plasmodesmata, kind of the same thing, only just in plants. We only find it in plants. So those cytoplasmic connections, again, these are cells that are physically touching each other, and communicating that way. So as mentioned in the other video, so these are cell-to-cell interactions when the cells are physically touching each other, they're attached to each other, and there are these channels that they can communicate through. But sometimes cells have to communicate with cells that are maybe close to each other, but not touching. So then we would say they're in close proximity, and that's when there's a couple of different ones that were mentioned. They mentioned paracrine signaling and also electrochemical signaling that might be used. That's how neurons, remember that nerve cells are not physically touching each other, but they're close, so they have that synapse where they have to send those electrochemical signals through, or from one nerve cell to another. And then also sometimes cells are really far apart. And this is where hormones come into play. So hormones are made in one area of the body and maybe carried in the bloodstream to another area of the body that's attached to cells and send a signal to cells that are really very far away. So that's called an endocrine signal. And then an autocrine signal is when a cell sends a signal to itself. So it creates a molecule that's used as a signal. It leaves the cell, but then attaches to the outside of the cell that triggers some sort of cellular process. And that's it.